How's everybody? Alright, this is Dennis Cheng here. I'm in Tokyo and about to fly back to Canada tomorrow for 3 months of work. And well, I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of old friends, but I'm gonna miss Japan. Anyway, today I want to talk about something that is very, very close to my heart, very dear to me. It's kind of how I learned music and something I'm very, very passionate about. It's this idea of learning music through history. And what I mean by that, is it even worth it? Well, I'm actually going to tell you right now, to the degree that I do it, statistically speaking, I don't think it's worth it. People have rightfully accused me of going a bit overboard, but it's just my thing, you know, you do what you like, I do what I like, you do what you like. But I'm just going to tell you where I'm coming from. And what I mean by statistically not worth it is, I'm not saying this to show up, but I'm one of the only people on this planet to go really that far into such fine detail for things that no one really picks up on. Even people, practitioners of the things that of the style. We're talking about gypsy jazz, bebop, or whatever, swing. So, for example, like namely the idea that when guitar players played chunk 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 rhythm in the 1930s, whether it's Django style or Eddie Line, whatever, it seems based on my research, at least in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, they almost never played minor 7 chords. Pianists did do that, but more as in terms of voice leading, generally speaking. But guitar players tended to play just, if we're in the key of G, D7 like this. You know, one thing that's popular in the swing movement today is to play G chords like this. But if you listen to recordings in the old days, they were playing a lot of G chords like this. For me, of course, it's still an ongoing research. I'm still trying to determine exactly like what chords they were playing. But this, according to my research so far, is far more common this. But yet nowadays in the swing movement, most people are playing this. So that already makes it a little bit different from what it was historically back then. Does it really matter? No. Why? Because most people don't even realize it. Even the people who are playing, the people who are into that stuff, who are studying that stuff, don't really notice it. Because this is stuff that's really actually hard to figure out, namely because of the quality of the recordings back in those days. I had to sift through so many recordings where all right, this one, oh, I can finally hear the guitar. Oh, what chords is it? And I have to really, really concentrate. Oh, it's this chord. Oh, it's this one. So I did with Django Reinhardt, Charlie Christian, and whoever else that I could really listen to who made recordings and where the guitar is properly recorded. That's not to say that this was not played. But I'm still looking. Actually, if you guys know, you guys tell me where we can hear this, like playing this kind of chord in the 1930s. Now, already in the 1930s, Freddie Green was doing something a little bit different from what he was doing. What he's known to be doing, like the 1-2 string stuff. I made a video about this, I think last year or 2 years ago. You can watch that. So he might be a potential person who, a potential guitar player to play something like this. But even then, that was not, according to my research anyway, that was not his philosophy. His philosophy was really voice leading and all that stuff. So, and that's, speaking of Freddie Green, I've said this in videos. He actually, in my opinion, is a bit of an outlier in terms of rhythm guitar. Yet he has set the standard for today's rhythm. Everyone is copying him and kind of like ignoring all the other rhythm guitar players that existed back in the day. Check out the recordings from, I think, early 40s of Charlie Parker and a guitar player named F. Ridge Ware, and you can hear him playing voicings from the era of the 30s. And there were other players just like him, but again, nowadays, everyone is only talking about Freddie Green because he was the most famous. And of course, he's great, but historically speaking, he was one of the exceptions. It's kind of as if we were going to study bebop and we ignore Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Kanye West, and we only study Thelonious Monk's solos. Only Thelonious Monk's solo. Now, Thelonious Monk, if you hear him improvise, he's kind of a rebel. He's doing all the things, the unconventional things, so to speak. Very, generally speaking, un-bebop-like, quote-unquote. And that's what I'm getting at. So if you're like interested in the history, you can't just look at one person, especially the exception. The exception is very worthy to note, of course, but you have to look at the global perspective. But then why do I even do this? Okay, for me, I just love history. But it's also for artistic reasons. And especially nowadays when you learn music through jazz, everything is kind of informed through the lens of music school. And I think, of course, music schools are great. I've made a video about this. But it tends to influence your decisions. And it's kind of, therefore, it skews the history a little bit in favor of what it's being taught. And the easiest proof of this is like most jazz teachers nowadays don't know songs like Chic of Araby, My Melancholy Baby, Coquette, After You All. Emmett Cohen made it After You've Gone Famous, but before that it was not famous at all. All these old songs that were very, very popular in the day, and songs that people like Charlie Parker or Wes Montgomery have actually recorded because they grew up with that music. Well, those songs are not really known today. And that's proof that kind of the modern music school system is dictating the history. Because, as I've said in previous videos, jazz education as we know it today is a recent thing. And it was founded by people from the generation of the modern standards. The people who created that school and their kind of musical descendants have long forgotten the era from before. But actually, if you study the 1920s and 1930s jazz, a lot of things from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond nowadays make a whole lot of sense. Like, namely, the history of the 251. I talk about that in my harmony course on Stylistic. You can check it out. It's really, really good. And if you checked out my interview with Jonathan Stout, I think it was 2 years ago that we did that interview. Yeah, wow, 2 years. Time flies by. We talked about kind of the traps of trying to play quote-unquote historically accurate music. Namely, the biggest hurdle is that we are in the present, and that's a thing of the past. And in some ways, he's right. And Pat Martino has said this as well. I don't remember his exact words, so I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying like, Bebop doesn't exist anymore because that was something of that era, and we're living in the modern era. At least when he did that interview, it was like 20, 30 years ago, but it's still valid today. What that means is that when you study music historically, you're going to start to see a lot of tendencies. And then as an artist in the modern era, you have to decide, okay, what am I going to do when I play music? Am I going to do something a little bit that wasn't done in those days? In which case, you're taking off kind of layers from the authenticity. And you can take a few layers off here and there, and it's fine. But if you start taking too many, like if you start playing the altered scale in the 1920s accompaniment, altered scale, and half what do you call that, the octatonic scale, and all these substitutions that are very common nowadays, it stops being what it is, right? I subscribe to the idea that music should be free. You play however you want, anything goes. But when you have too much freedom, sometimes it ends up being chaos, and something that I notice a lot in jam sessions, even among quote-unquote proficient players, so to speak. I remember many times I've gone to jam sessions where there's a singer or maybe an old school player who wants to play, an old school song that kind of, in my opinion, should be played in the old way, but then you have the drummer start doing all these polyrhythms, the bass player adding all these polyrhythms as well, and all these substitutions, and you're playing Autumn Leaves, and you play it like this. Yeah. What I just did can theoretically work over Autumn Leaves, but imagine you're accompanying an old school singer. That's just nonsense, right? So stuff like that, you make informed choices. It's kind of like going to a bluegrass jam session and saying, hey, can we play Spain by Chick Corea? I've seen this because a lot of people, they're from kind of the product of the music school, or everything is just put into one category. Jazz is just jazz. I mean, they have little categories, modern, standards, whatever, to a certain extent, but jazz, they don't know that, for example, Autumn Leaves is a composition of the mid-40s. And therefore, the harmonies to Autumn Leaves reflect that era. That kind of chord structure was very, very, very atypical in the 30s. You have other songs, Satin Doll. Well, Duke Ellington, you'd say, oh, he's a musician of the 30s, so this is a 30s style song. No, Duke Ellington composed this in the height of the bebop era. Okay, I'm not sure, but I think I'm right. It's not a song of the 30s, and then it reflects in the chord choices, and in fact, okay, I didn't double check. I'm kind of making this video off the cuff like this, but I think I have checked. If you look at the original recording that Duke did, nowadays on the lead sheet it says at the end it says A minor 7, D7, A flat minor 7, D flat 7, C, which is that kind of West Montgomery 251. But actually the original is just D7, D flat 9 to C. So adding that 2 chord makes it a little bit more modern. So then there's the whole culture around the style. So 1930s jazz, I mean, you have the different camps, the New Orleans style, and you have kind of like the Kansas City style. It's a little bit different, right? If you can hear it, difference between Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong, and then you check out like Lester Young, Charlie Christian, stuff like that. There is the whole culture behind the music that also affects how the music is played. And so what I have to do when I study this music is kind of get rid of all the preconceived notions that I have, all the studying that I have done academically, the things that I take for granted, really. And I have to try to at least read stories, newspaper articles, to get an idea of kind of the social, political conditions they grew up in. And it does affect the music, because, you know, I'm thinking someone like Louis Armstrong, who was an amazing improviser, he grew up very, very troubled. And then he wasn't at home practicing his 2-5-1 licks or arpeggio or this, whatnot. He was just, first of all, in an environment where he could hear music, and then he found people who nurtured his talent. But in those days, they didn't have jazz education the way we know it. So he got rudimentary music education, kind of like the music education that you would get if you sent your kids to take piano lessons or violin lessons, like basic scales, basic arpeggios, harmonies. And everything else was through community, and it was a very organic process, and that dictates the style that he came up with, and that applies to everyone else. Now, of course, some people were more learned. That's a word I learned from The Simpsons. Papa Homer, you are so learned. Learned, Pepe, learned. So yes, you'll have people who are kind of more like street oriented. All of them, they all start out kind of in the street way, but some of them were a little more quote unquote educated, but not to the extent that people tend to be educated today. So case in point, you know, a lot of people take for granted that, you know, okay, 2-5-1. So then you see a song like I Can't Give You Anything But Love. I've talked about this before. So I can't give you anything but love. But this is just not in the old style. This is really not. It should be I can give you anything but love. You check out a whole bunch of recordings. Oh, my guitar is beautifully out of tune. So things like this. And of course, you have people like Django Reinhardt. So you see that solo I did. I played kind of one solo in the quote-unquote New Orleans style-ish of the 30s. Then a solo in the Kansas City style of the 30s. Then a gypsy jazz thing. And then after a bebop thing. So let me just talk about that. The fact that I played it on a guitar, let alone an modern electric guitar, makes it inauthentic. But this is the only guitar I have before I leave tomorrow. Everything's in a storage room. But even if I had an acoustic guitar, in the 30s, there were not a lot of soloists playing in that style, and as well as Louis Armstrong or Sidney Bechet. Django Reinhardt, Oscar Aleman are the two probably really famous players in that really, really old style. Eddie Lang died very young, and even then, Eddie Lang's soloing was, if I may dare say, I hope I don't piss anyone off, was beautiful. But let's be honest, it was not as sophisticated as Django's improvisations. And then, of course, Django had influences from outside of jazz as well. He was into classical music, so you can hear little things that he did, you know. And when it comes to stylistic interpretation, most people are focusing on the soloing, less on the rhythm section. That's where actually I'm most interested in. So if I just used the gypsy jazz backing track, so when I started playing bebop, it's kind of a little bit weird, isn't it, with a gypsy jazz rhythm section. But it is what it is. And like I said, it's the layer concept is good. Like you peel off one layer, maybe it's not such a big deal, but you keep peeling, and then at one point it stops being what you're trying to do if you're going to go for something anyway. So let me just talk about what I did, my first improvisation. The first A section is kind of inspired by Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet. Hopefully you can hear some of that vocabulary where I kind of already started by quoting the melody, right? That's very, very typical of those players in those days. And then after the second A, I played kind of in a Charlie Christian way, and I took some ideas from him, of course, and from Lester Young, and I did that. The third one is gypsy jazz. So gypsy jazz is what I think I am best at. It took me a bit of time to make that solo, to really try to be quote-unquote as authentic as possible. But the gypsy jazz were that just took me one take. I did it in one take because gypsy jazz, it comes from Django Reinhardt. And so obviously there's quite a lot of Djangoism, but there's also the kind of the freedom to do whatever you kind of want to do. You don't have to really worry about, oh, if I do this, it's not authentic, to a certain extent, to a higher degree than the previous two other styles. So I like playing gypsy jazz for that reason. Gypsy jazz phrasing, I mean, depends on the players, tends to be very, very notey, big range. And there's that gypsy feel, you know, like that is very typical. Django did that, but a lot of gypsy players have really attached themselves to that kind of sound. Ornaments. And I did some things that modern jazz players tend to do, kind of the use of altered scale, altered sound anyway, in some of my stuff. So I'm not really thinking about, oh, I shouldn't do this or that. I should only do this, so if I want to sound style, I just go for it. And one guy who made that popular was Birel Legren. He showed that you can still sound in the style, but yet still mix with a lot of outside influences. To a certain extent. And then the last one was a bebop thing. That's another style that I'm kind of, I would say, at ease with because I have a lot of freedom. Now, this is very interesting. Bebop is something very, very hard to define. A lot of people nowadays, when they say bebop, they're just talking about the idea of playing jazz standards that are very typical around the world, style by style. So not really necessarily talking even about stylistic considerations. Because a lot of people who play bebop, quote unquote, don't really play bebop like they did in the 40s and 50s. And this is very interesting. This is a point of interest for me. Like, I've always been curious, when did the octatonic scale, the altered scale, and all these other scales start to become very, very prevalent in that era? So my research shows that the altered scale was not really used in the 40s. Charlie Parker didn't use it. I haven't studied Dizzy Gillespie as much, but I don't hear it. Now, it's in the composition Hot House, which is from the mid-40s. It's this other song, I think it's called Conception. There's also an altered scale in the composition itself, but in the improvisation, and when I mean altered scale, like very unambiguously altered scale, the way we hear it today, like, or that, yeah, you just didn't really hear that sound very unambiguously. You did hear little fragments of it, but it's very ambiguous. Because one thing that is very popular in the 40s and in Charlie Parker's era, but also in the 30s, is, let's say you had a diamond chord and you play the note C, B flat, A. That was very, very, very typical, but it's not coming from a scale per se. It's just an ornament. And then after, they might do a regular arpeggio. It's theoretically, strictly speaking, the only possible scale would be octatonic, but they were not thinking octatonic. They were just singing this ornament. In fact, they might even play harmonic minor and just have that ornament. That's C natural, but then harmonic minor or Phrygian dominant, whatever you want. I don't care about the names. So that was very typical. There is an instance in that famous 1943, I think, Cherokee by Charlie Parker with an F. Rich Ware and a drummer, where Charlie Parker kind of hints at notes from the altered scale, but it's still very ambiguous. So that's something that's very interesting. My research also shows, in terms of improvisation, the altered scale started to be very, very widespread by the mid-50s, late 50s, and onwards. Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery, Britney Spears, and all that stuff. So for me, all that is very, very interesting to know, so that I can make these artistic choices when I'm playing. So if I'm playing, let's say a singer shows up and that singer decides she wants to sing Moonglow, then I'm gonna solo kind of appropriately. I try not to do too many advanced things, and I hope the rhythm section is gonna be fairly conservative. You know, it just depends on the situation. You know, this thing, it's not just music, but even my Japanese teachers that told me, like, I'm one of those students that kind of probably annoys my teachers because I ask them questions that they cannot answer. In the Japanese language, there's this thing called pitch accent that Japanese people themselves are not actively aware of. They're only maybe subconsciously aware of, and they don't actually study this in school. I even know the technical terms. When I told that to some Japanese students, like, what are you saying? What is that? And I explained, oh, it's this. Oh, I didn't know. They just speak it naturally. Japanese has this thing, pitch accent, that I'm really studying very, very deeply. And I stumped quite a lot of Japanese people with this. Me, as an outsider, I have to learn this if I want to kind of sound like them, because I didn't grow up with it and it's hard for me to just pick it up naturally. But I'm starting to actually get how it works naturally sometimes, so that's very, very cool. But there's this sentence I want to read to you that I read to someone that I saw on a YouTube video. And a Japanese teacher said, here, click on this link and copy this announcer's voice if you want to speak Tokyo dialect, because there are many dialects in Japan. So the pitch accent varies according to dialect, according to region. Kind of like in the, you know, you can say tomato, that kind of thing. But it's very funny because that YouTuber said, watch this video and copy the announcer. But what I found out, I got confused because when I listened to the announcer, he did not pronounce things according to the Tokyo dialect. So I asked a bunch of Japanese people, that they were stumped too. It's like, maybe this person was originally from another area, and that accent kind of maybe have crept into his job. When you work for like Tokyo TV, you're supposed to use the standard professional Tokyo dialect. But that guy made some little things, so little mistakes, or someone said maybe it's just a habit that person has. But also, pitch accent can change according to your emotions. So you can, like, the most common one is like the word maybe, tabun. But I hear this a lot. A lot of Japanese, they will say tabun, because just to stress that. But here's that sentence according to the correct Tokyo dialect. 今日は関東から東海にかけて雪が降っていて、内陸では10センチ前後の雪が積もっています。So, already, well, hopefully I got it right, but that's the official correct way. But I said 今日は, but the announcer said 今日は. That's already a different pitch accent. So when I showed this to like the Japanese person, like, oh, you're right, it's different. I don't know why. And then Kanto, which is the region where Tokyo is, Kanto. That's the official pronunciation. But the announcer said Kanto. That's very, very different. So it's so interesting that the person, the YouTuber that was trying to teach correct Tokyo pitch accent, used this video as a reference when the announcer made mistakes in the pronunciation. Mistakes, quote unquote. So it's something that I'm very fascinated with. And that's how I studied music. And this is how I studied Japanese as well. I piss off a lot of my Japanese teachers. And one last thing. When I got my teacher, one of my teachers, I asked this to a lot of my teachers, but when I asked my teacher to, without even telling him what the purpose of this was, I asked the teacher, can you read this sentence for me very, very slowly? I want to hear how you pronounce the words. So he has no idea that I'm trying to check for his pitch accent. So when he read it slowly, he quote unquote messed up a few of the pitch accents. And when I pointed that out, oh, I noticed that you pronounce this word this way, that way, and that way. It's like, oh, it's because when I'm speaking slowly, you made me nervous. I have to like really concentrate, and I don't even know what it's supposed to sound like. So I then asked him, well, can you read it quickly without even thinking? So that when he read it quickly without even thinking, it came out correctly according to the standard Tokyo. So if you force a Japanese person to think about what they're doing, they might mess up. Unless they've studied this before. And it's the same thing with music. A lot of players in those days, historically, they were doing the thing that they were doing without putting much thought into it. Whereas today, when we're studying that thing, we have to put a little bit more thought into it because that was then, this is now. That's what I'm getting. I get this experience all the time with Gypsy players. Many of you know that I work a lot with Gypsy musicians, Synthi players from Django's tribe. A lot of them have no idea that they're doing this or that, and sometimes I point it out to them and I was like, oh really, I didn't know that. It's just so natural. But when you're coming from an outside background, you kind of, unless you're gifted in that way, you learn things naturally, you might have to put some thought into it. And at one point, you may be able to, after enough effort, you do pick things up naturally. That certainly was the case with me with Gypsy Jazz. I did put a lot of active conscious effort into learning these subtleties, but at one point I started to feel it the same way they can feel it too. So yeah, there we go.